Just to summarize what we did in the previous lecture. Thank you. As I said, we in last week lecture we looked at the aggregate demand, aggregate supply. We looked at the macroeconomic equilibrium in the short run and the macroeconomic equilibrium in the long run, and what would shift the long run aggregate supply, what would shift the short run aggregate supply, and the same thing like we looked at the aggregate demand and what would shift the aggregate demand curve. In the last lecture we looked at the aggregate demand. We just focus on the aggregate demand, and we looked at the components of the aggregate demand. We are interested to know what determines the aggregate demand. So that means we need to understand what determines the components of the aggregate demand. So the aggregate demand is the demand that comes from all sectors. We know that now the economy could be divided into 4 sectors. What are these 4 sectors? Households, firms, government, and the outside world. These are the four sectors. So their expenditure plans, right? These from these sectors, from all of these sectors, compose the aggregate expenditure, which is the aggregate demand. So that it comes from all these sectors together. So we started by looking at the first component. We start to look at C, the consumption expenditure. And we ask it what determines the consumption expenditure. It was it is the disposable income, the after-tax income, and hopefully now we understand the relationship between these two. So as the disposable income increases, consumption increases. Consumption expenditure increases. And because the disposable income is split between consumption and saving, then we want to know now how much you would spend, or in an economy households will spend. Remember, household spending consumption, so consumption expenditure comes from households. Okay, so how much they would spend on consumption and how much they would save, and this depend on the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save in any economy. So what is the marginal propensity to consume? If the increase in your income was £100, you spend in consumption £80, that makes the marginal propensity to consume 80%, because simply you spent on consumption 80% of the increase in your income. Okay, and in the same time you save 20, and that makes your marginal propensity to save, or that makes the marginal propensity to save in this economy is 20%. So these two together, the sum of marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save, now we know that it equals 1. And again, the reason is because these are the only 2 channels that we account for when we think of how people or how households, just to be more accurate, what they do with the increase in their income. So they either spend in consumption or saving. So there's no third option. So there's no third channel. So these are the 2 channels. That's why they take 100% of the increase in income, in disposable income, and that means the sum of marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save will be 100% or will be equal 1. Then we move from this now. So this is the first component, that's consumption. Then we said, okay, what about the other components? There are 2 components that are determined by the income level or the real GDP, and these 2 are consumption and imports, and we call these induced expenditures. Okay, the other 3 components, the investment, government expenditure, and exports, are not determined by income level or by the real GDP, so they're not influenced by the real GDP, and that's why we call them autonomous expenditures. Then we thought of the aggregate expenditure. So the aggregate expenditure is the sum of these expenditures, C plus I plus G plus X plus minus M, sorry, and we know that 2 of these are induced expenditure, 3 are autonomous expenditures. Then we saw how we could represent the aggregate expenditure in this curve. Let me just go back to that one. And then how did we come to that point? Yeah, this one. So we see that the 3 components, the autonomous expenditures, I plus G, I plus G plus X, so the 3 of them, they could be represented by a horizontal line, meaning that they're not affected or they're not influenced by the real GDP. But when we add the consumption function into the picture, we know now how consumption function looks like. So that's how it looks like. Okay, so the top one here, that the one that includes I plus G plus X plus C. So the top one, the very top one, that represents the aggregate expenditure when we introduce these 4 components together. So when we have these 4 components together, and again, you see consumption at this point starts from the sum of these. So it doesn't start from 0, it does start at 5. It starts at the sum of the autonomous expenditure. So I plus G plus X. When we add imports is in the equation is minus imports. So that's why you will see that we go down to the aggregate expenditure. So the aggregate expenditure here, this represent this red line. This represent the aggregate planned expenditures. And you'll see in the horizontal axis we have the real GDP. On the vertical axis we have the aggregate planned expenditure. And that's what all these sectors plan to spend, or all these planned expenditures, or planned consumption plus planned investment, planned government expenditure, planned net exports. So that's the aggregate expenditure, or the aggregate planned expenditure. We know from the last lecture that the actual aggregate expenditure always equal real GDP. So we're not worried about that. So to look for the equilibrium point, we want that point where the aggregate planned expenditure, which we see here, equal real GDP, because it means it equals the actual. So what is planned, or the planned expenditure equal the actual one, or equal the real GDP. So yeah, so we stopped at that point, and as I said, this is very important graph, just to show you, because that's the main point behind this lecture, is how the aggregate demand would determine the level of real GDP. That's the main question in this lecture and in the previous lecture. So what we see here, this is the in the top section, you will see on the horizontal axis we have the real GDP, and the vertical axis we have the aggregate planned expenditure. And the red line here that's the same function we have here, so it's the same. So this is the aggregate expenditure. So it's the sum of the aggregate planned expenditure. So it's the sum of planned consumption plus planned investment, planned government expenditure, planned net export. Okay, so this is just remember, this is the red one, the red line. But what about the black line, the 45 degrees line? Remember, I said this line is very important. Okay, so this line tells us where the real GDP equal the aggregate planned expenditure. Okay, remember, the real GDP always gonna be equal the actual aggregate expenditure. But what we have here is the planned expenditure, which is this red line, the aggregate planned expenditure. So we want to see where the equilibrium is, meaning where the level of the GDP at which you will have the real GDP equal the aggregate expenditure. Okay? Obviously, it is point D. At this point, as I said, so all the points on that black line mean that real GDP equal aggregate expenditure. But when we see the aggregate expenditure curve here, which is the red one, actually cross that point or that 45 degrees line, this is where they are equal. So this is where exactly the aggregate expenditure at this point. So this D point is on the same, on the 45 degrees line and on the aggregate expenditure line in the same time. So that means it's the same, it's equal. Meaning at that point, D, the real GDP equal the aggregate expenditure. Okay? So what all firms produced, is that the real GDP? Yeah? So what all firms produced equal what all sectors plan to spend. That's equilibrium. So what we plan to spend equal what we have, what the real GDP we have. So then what if this is not the case? What if the aggregate expenditure does not equal real GDP? And as we said, the aggregate planned expenditure may differ, might be different from the real GDP. Okay? So on that graph, points A, B, C, E, F, all these points show you these cases where aggregate expenditure does not equal real GDP. We have only one point, actually it's only one point at which the aggregate expenditure equal real GDP, which is point D. So that's the equilibrium point, and that is the real GDP level. That is where the equilibrium will be in that time, in this economy as well. Okay? So what about the other points? What about the other cases when aggregate expenditure, what all sectors plan to spend, that's the aggregate expenditure, doesn't match what all firms produced? Then there's no equilibrium, then there's a problem. Okay? And how this gonna take us back to equilibrium, it is very important. The process, the mechanism, how it works. How we gonna go back to D, to that equilibrium point. A very important thing to understand is how the unplanned change in inventories will take us back to this. So let's just give an example. Let's say the aggregate expenditure, or what people, let's just make, like, use simple words. Let's say if what we spend or what we plan to spend or what we spending does not buy or does not equal what firms produced. So that means they're not going to be able to sell all what they produced. Where the rest going to go to? It's going to go to their inventories. So they're going to keep it. So if you're running a business, what is the sign? What this signal for the next year? Are you going to produce the same amount? Or are you going to produce less? Or are you going to produce more? So this year, you produce 100 pieces of whatever, 100 units of anything, any product. People bought 80. You didn't plan to keep 20. You actually thought that you're going to sell 100. So now you're not able to sell the 20. That means the aggregate expenditure is less than real GDP. Okay? So what would you do if you're running that business next year? Are you going to increase your production? No, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. You couldn't sell what you produced last year. Okay? What you planned to sell last year, you couldn't. Are you going to produce the same? No, again, it does. Yes, yeah, it's not going to happen. It's true. Why? It doesn't make sense. You couldn't sell all what you produced. What makes sense here is that you're gonna reduce your output, your production. Okay? So you're gonna produce less. Okay? So again, so let's just focus on this. Now use the terms we use here. So that case means when aggregate expenditure is less than real GDP. Firms will have unplanned change in their inventories. So their unplanned inventories will increase. So they didn't plan to have this inventory. They didn't have to have this 20 in their stores. They actually were hoping to sell it. So next year they produce less. So in that graph, this is when, again, aggregate expenditure is less than real GDP. And that is point A and F. So if you look at point E and F, this is the level of aggregate expenditure. Think of the black line as the level of real GDP. Then the real GDP is above the aggregate expenditure, or in other words, the aggregate expenditure is less than the real GDP. Going back to the same example I gave now, firms are not able to sell what they plan to sell. Okay? So what will happen? Now, they didn't plan for this, but that's what happened. Then they have an increase, unplanned increase. So they didn't plan for it. They didn't hope for that. So they have unplanned increase in their inventories. And that will make them reduce their output, which means reducing the GDP. So GDP will move toward D. Okay? So that's very important. So they will fire people, they will stop their production lines or whatever. I mean, they will cut down their production. They're not going to produce the same. So the real GDP will drop. So real GDP dropping means that we're moving toward D until we come to point D. What happened at point D? Aggregate expenditure equal real GDP, which is point D. That's the equilibrium point. It's very important to understand the process. And that's why I'm explaining this in very detailed way. So it's very important. And also think of very, very simple example like the one I gave now. Okay, that would help. Like 100, that's the real GDP. That's what people produce. That's what firms produce, and people spend only 80, or all households, all sectors spend 80. So that makes the aggregate expenditure less than real GDP. What firms would do, then that means there will be 20 unplanned inventory. So the unplanned inventory increased by 20, and that means they will reduce their production, their output next time or next year, which means this will reduce GDP and will move back toward point D. So that is the case when we have, we could be at F or E. What about if the other case, the other way now? So let's say, think of the 100 units these firms produced, but people actually wanted 120 or 130. So in that case, the aggregate expenditure is above or is greater than real GDP. So people want 130, but what firms produce? 100. So what firm is going to do? Well, they're going to use their inventories from previous years to respond to this increase in the aggregate expenditure. This increase they didn't plan for, they didn't expect. Okay? So again, this will cause unplanned decrease or drop in their inventories. What's going to happen next year? Well, they will be prepared for next year. They're not going to produce 100, they're going to produce 130. Yeah? So they're going to try to respond to what happened last year. They don't want the same thing to happen in their inventories. Okay? So it's something they didn't plan for. So the idea here in this example, or in this case, we are at A, B, or C, where the aggregate expenditure is above the real GDP. Again, think of the black line as real GDP. The red one is the aggregate expenditure. Okay? Sorry. Yeah. Okay? So the black line is the real GDP. Think of this as the real GDP. And the red line, the aggregate expenditure. So at points A, B, C, aggregate expenditure is above real GDP. So the second example. So when all sectors demand or want to spend 130, but what firms produces just 100. Okay, so that will cause unplanned decrease or drop in their inventories, because they have to respond to this. They will bring from their inventories from last year or previous years. So that's something they didn't plan for, and this means they have unplanned drop in their inventories, and next year or next time they will increase their output, which means increasing real GDP. So we'll move toward D. So that's what it means. So the process here is very important, or the mechanism through which we go back to equilibrium, which point D is important to understand. And again, what is the points? What's point D? This is where aggregate expenditure, the red line, equal real GDP, the black line. Okay? So at that point, this we have equilibrium. And if there is disequilibrium, or we are not at that point, not at equilibrium point, the changes to the unplanned changes to inventories will make us or take us back to equilibrium. And that's what you see on the this bottom section, this lower section here. So this explains what happened to the unplanned inventories, so or unplanned change to inventories. So when the aggregate expenditure is above the real GDP, points A, B, and C, you will see we have unplanned decrease in inventories, and that's why they will increase their output, which means increasing real GDP. So that means they will hire more workers. They will start like increasing their production. So we'll move back to equilibrium, which D, and at D, the unplanned change in inventory equals 0. There's nothing unplanned, so there's no unplanned change in inventory. So at point D, the aggregate expenditure equal real GDP, and there's no unplanned change in inventories. But point A, E, and F, you will see that now, if you look at this, the lower like part of this section of this figure here, you'll see E and F. You will see unplanned increase in inventories because we have the aggregate expenditure is less than the real GDP. So that's the main point, okay? And that's the main story here. So that's how the aggregate demand determine the level of real GDP. So when the aggregate expenditure equal real GDP, which is represented by point D here. So as I said, think of I know 45 degrees line is where the real GDP equal aggregate expenditure. Okay, and that's point D. Point D, that's where the aggregate expenditure, the red line, equal the real GDP, and that's where equilibrium is. And at that point, there is the unplanned change in inventories equal to 0. So there's no increase or decrease in the unplanned inventories. So so all is fine, and we're going back to equilibrium, and that's how the process works. Okay. Okay. So that was the point, and these are the probably 3-4 slides coming after this graph. It's just saying exactly the same thing what I said now. Okay. So this is if we are below equilibrium, so before equilibrium, what would happen, and how we're going to converge, or how we're going to go back to equilibrium, or if we are at point above the equilibrium level. Sorry. So this is the story, and then at equilibrium point, as I said, the aggregate expenditure equal real GDP, and there is no unplanned change in inventories. Okay, so that is the main story here. So now we understand the equilibrium. What would change that point? D. What can change that point? Meaning how what can happen to the aggregate demand, because we now understand the aggregate demand determines the real GDP. So what can happen to the aggregate demand that can change that point D? or the equilibrium point? Well, of course, if one of the components of the aggregate demand change. So what are these components? C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay? Remember when we make this distinction between autonomous and induced expenditures. Okay? So basically what I'm talking about here, if one of the autonomous expenditure change, if investment level change, if government spending change, export change, how that's going to affect the aggregate demand. So let's say if just to explain the idea, let's say the government decided, I'm talking about G now, okay? So G is one of the autonomous expenditure. That's one of the components in the autonomous expenditure. So let's say now the government decided to increase their G by 100 million or whatever. So let's say £100. Okay? So just to simplify things, let's say think of £100. So what's going to happen? So now in the example in your assignment, this is not related to your assignment, but we had a fiscal stimulus, which means the government spend on the economy. They spend £100. What is this £100 to the to people who receive them? It's an increase in their income. Yeah. So then when people receive more income, or the income increase, what are they gonna do? Exactly. So they're gonna spend some of these 100. Just remember this £100. So they're gonna spend part of this £100 on consumption and save some of it, or save the rest. Okay. So how much are they gonna spend in consumption? It depends on the marginal propensity to consume. Remember? So remember it's the same example with the £100 I gave you. I didn't give you £100, but I say the example I talked about. Okay, so so now it's just the £100. Now we know where they came from. They came from the government, from J. Okay, so the government increased their spending by £100, and these £100, some people receive those £100. What they're gonna do? Well, they're gonna spend some part of this increase in consumption, and the rest on save, and that will depend on the marginal propensity to consume in this economy. And let's assume, just to simplify things, it's 80%. So that means when G increased by £100, when government decided to spend £100 more, then people income so increased by £100, and those who receive those £100, they're gonna spend £80 because marginal propensity to consume is 80, and they're gonna save £20. But this is not the end of the story. Why? Because when they spend the £80, they spend it in this economy, okay, the society. Other people receive those £80. So what does it mean to them? It means that their income increased by £80. What are they gonna do? So for me, I spend the £80, but for that person who received them, their income increased by £80. So what are they gonna do? They're gonna do the same thing. So they're gonna spend some of these £80 and save the rest. So assuming that they have the same marginal propensity to consume, that means they will spend £64 and they will save £16. So let's go back to this, the main story now. So this is not the end of the story yet. Okay. So we start again with the £100. Again, why are we talking about this? We're talking about what would change that D point. Remember that D point, the equilibrium point. What can happen to the aggregate demand that will change the real GDP. Okay. So one of the components, the autonomous expenditure here, is G. So we know the autonomous expenditure, investment, G, or export. So let's talk about the government expenditure, which is G. So the government increased their spending by £100. This £100 is income for some people, so their income increased by £100, and now we know the story. We know what they're gonna do with this £100. They're gonna spend £80, given that their marginal propensity to consume is 80%, and they're gonna save £20. Those who receive the £80, this is again, that means their income increased by £80, so they're gonna do the same. So they're gonna spend £64 and save £16. Those who receive the £64, they're gonna do the same, assuming that they have the marginal propensity to consume is 80%. Again, they're gonna spend some and save some, and this will continue. The increase in income will vanish, will end. Okay, so the impact or the effect in the economy of one shot or one off here, this is one increase, yeah. So the government increased their G, or their government expenditure, once, but the effect in the economy is going more than that, is much larger than this, and that is what we call the multiplier. Okay, so in this example, the government spent £100, they increase their G by £100. The final impact in the economy will be the sum of these 100 plus 80 plus 64 until you come to the end of this. Yeah, and using the idea of the multiplier, you can calculate this very easily. And I can tell you now, the final impact in the economy will be 500. How did I come up with this? Is by calculating the multiplier. And the multiplier, as I'm going to show you now, is 5 in our case. And this depends on the marginal propensity to consume, which is 80%. So that's what we're going to learn now. So that the idea of the multiplier here is very simple, but it's very important. And as I said, I want you to understand it. I don't want you really to memorize or to learn the definition. I just want you to understand what it means. So when one of the autonomous expenditure change, in our example here was G, but we have the autonomous expenditure are I, G, or X. So when one of those change, then this will change the equilibrium expenditure and real GDP. But by how much? That's the idea. So the change in the equilibrium expenditure is larger than the change in the autonomous expenditure. In my example was £100, that's the change in G, and the final impact in the economy will be 500, will be 5 times that change, the 5 times 100. That will end up with having £500 increase in real GDP and income. So that's the idea. So if you want to define the multiplier as the amount by which change in the autonomous expenditure is magnified or multiplied, and that's where it comes from, the name, to determine the change in equilibrium expenditure and real GDP. How we calculate the multiplier is very, very easy. That's just the story I gave you now. So how we calculate the multiplier, we'll see now. So what you can see here in this graph is just show you what would happen if G, for example, increased this, or actually in this example is investment. The aggregate expenditure curve will shift upward. So remember, this is the previous one, AE0, and what happened here is, in this example you see now, the investment, again, investment is one of the autonomous expenditure. So what are the autonomous expenditure? Investment, government expenditure, and export. So the example I gave you was, I was talking about G. The example you see on the screen now is an increase in investment by $0.5 trillion. Okay, so this is the impact of the increase by 0.5 in investment. The final impact in the economy is $2 trillion. So it's much larger than 0.5. So it's 4 times 0.5. So that makes the multiplier in this case, not in my case, this case, not the case I just explained with the G. So in this case, in this particular case on the screen now, that makes the multiplier equal 4. Okay, why? Because the increase in the change, or the change in the investment was 0.5, but the final impact in real GDP was 2. Okay, so that means 4 times 0.5. So the multiplier is 4 times 0.5. That gives us the change in the real GDP, which is 2. It moves from 16, or it increased from 16 to 18. And here how we calculate the multiplier. So as you see, the idea is not to memorize or to learn the formula. The idea is to understand what it means, the multiplier. But again, you still need to know how to calculate it. The multiplier is just the slope of this function, of the aggregate expenditure function. Sorry, it's not the slope. It's 1 divided by 1 minus the slope of this function, sorry. So that's the formula. It's 1 divided by the 1 minus the slope of the aggregate expenditure curve. And the multiplier will be greater than 1. So you see in my example there about the government expenditure, the multiplier was 5. In the second example here about when investment changed by 0.5, the multiplier was 4. So the multiplier always going to be more than 1. So meaning that when one of the autonomous expenditure increase or change, there will be a much larger change in the real GDP. Okay, so it's more than 1. Okay, so it's very important now to know also, if we have no income tax and no imports, the slope of the aggregate expenditure becomes the marginal propensity to consume. So it becomes the slope of the consumption function. It's the marginal propensity to consume. So that's why it was easy in my example to calculate it, because I assumed there is no tax and no income tax and no imports. So what I did, I said, well, if that is the case, that means the multiplier will be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. And the marginal propensity to consume in my example here was 0.8. So 1 over 1 minus 0.8, that means 1 over 0.2, and that gives us 5. That's how I knew that if the government expenditure increased by 100, these series of spending and income, this 100 plus 80 plus 64 at the end, we will increase by 5 times 100, which is 500. Okay, and that's how I knew that, because I just used the very simple case where I assume there's no income and income tax and there is no imports. But the problem is, well, there's no problem, but if there's the more realistic case when we have import and income taxes, then the multiplier size will be less than 5. It's not going to be exactly 5. Okay, it will be less than 5. Why? Because when people receive the £100, then they will pay, because this is income, so they will pay income tax. So what is left to spend in consumption, which is the disposable income in consumption and space saving, will be less than £80. And again, those who receive the £64, they can't spend £64. This is not their disposable income. This is their income before tax. And if they have to pay tax from these £64, then what is left, which is the disposable income after tax income, will be less than 64. So what is left to spend on consumption and spending will be less than 64. So that's why if we have income tax and import, that means the size of the multiplier will be less than 5. But in the case of that very simple case, I just assume there's no income tax and there's no imports, well, the multiplier would be 5 if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8. Okay, but in a more realistic case, it would be, of course, it would be less. So the imports and income taxes reduce the size of the multiplier. And just going back to the formula you have on this slide now, you see that because the 1 minus marginal propensity to consume, we know that the marginal propensity to consume plus the marginal propensity to save equal to 1. So that means 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume will be simply the marginal propensity to save. So that means you could calculate the multiplier based on this, which is multiplier equal 1 divided by 1 over the marginal propensity to save. Remember, this is the case when we assume there's no income tax or imports, because we know if there's import or income tax, the multiplier will be less, will be smaller than that. So in this example, this is just the example of investment. When investment increased by 0.5 and the real GDP increased by 2. That because of the multiplier was 4. How did we know that? So assuming there's no income tax or imports, so this is very straightforward. That means the slope of the aggregate expenditure curve should be the same as the marginal propensity to consume. So meaning that 1 divided by, or 1 over 1 minus the slope of the aggregate expenditure. So the slope of the aggregate expenditure now is the marginal cost. Sorry, is the marginal propensity to consume. I think I get tired. So it's just the marginal propensity to consume. Okay, so we're finishing in 5 minutes. I promise. Okay, I want to go more than you now. Okay, so so just go back, because this is the last thing. I'll finish with this example. So the idea here is that now the aggregate expenditure 0, this curve, so it moved upward to this aggregate expenditure 1 because of that increase 0.5 in investment, which again it's one of the autonomous expenditures. Okay, and the final impact should be this the what happened to the real GDP. So how did we know the multiplier? It's 1 over 1 minus the slope of the aggregate expenditure, which in this case is the marginal propensity to consume, and in this case it's 0.75. This is the same example we're following from the beginning of the lecture. If we add the tax and imports, this will make the slope of this 0.5, so be smaller, and in that case the multiplier will be 2. So that's the more realistic case when we have income, tax and imports. The multiplier size, you see, it changed from 4 to 2, but still more than 1. So we agree that the multiplier always going to be more than 1. Okay, so so that's the whole story. The last one here, just show you in this example, show you how actually another way to understand how the multiplier work. And if you really understand the example I gave about the £100 increase in the government expenditure and how this will create this series of expenditures in the economy, so the £100, which the increase in the government expenditure became an increase in income for people, and those people who receive those will spend £80, assuming that their marginal propensity to consume is 80%, and this will create another series when these people spend the £80, they will spend £64 and they will save £16 and so on. So this is the process. But what you see here, just show you, this is the 50, and this 50 will create in the second round here. So this is the cumulative increase from previous rounds. So what you see in the second column, for example, or second bar, that is the both together. So this is 100 plus 80 plus 64, and until we come to 200. So that means the multiplier in this case equal to 4, because the initial increase was 50, and the total increase here is 200. So that means 50 lead us to this 200 increase in the real GDP. That makes the multiplier 4. So 4 times 50 will give us 200. So that was the whole story about the multiplier. Just remember how the equilibrium is determined, because that's very important. So the equilibrium happens when the aggregate expenditure equal real GDP. If that is not the case, then the change on the unplanned change to in inventories will take us back to that equilibrium point, and then we discuss how this equilibrium point itself would change to another point. This, when one of the autonomous expenditure change, this will result in a much larger change in GDP, in real GDP, because of the multiplier. Okay, always remember that. Hopefully you remember that example of £100. Okay, do you have any questions? I like that, man, because I know I finish at that point. Any questions? So please join the Facebook group. Next lecture will be the last lecture. Next week will be the last lecture. I'll do one more lecture and then the revision. In the revision, I'll go through a mock exam, and also next week I will upload 3 exams with the solutions, 2 past papers and 1 mock exam. Okay, and of course, if you have any question after that, please, you can post your question Facebook group now, or you can email me, or you can come to my office. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week.